you cannot overstate how myopic Silicon Valley is. And then you fit that in the broader context of the US, that in all things thinks and acts as a superpower. And one of the things that struck me living in Silicon Valley was just how rare it was at the senior levels, where you're having meetings with presidents and prime ministers and the top levels of company leadership. And often this is done across a range of companies, not just one company. Almost always the majority of the people in that room were American. So it was very interesting being a foreigner in those rooms and hearing how dominant the American worldview was in it, and how not multilateralist, not cognizant of any special relationships in the way that those discussions went.
One of the things we are seeing in the world is governments in this geopolitical context weaponising dependencies and supply chain. And you can see it in all kinds of ways. You can see China doing it with critical minerals. You can see Iran doing it with the Strait of Hormuz. You can see the US looking to do it with some of the chip supplies and some other areas. And that does cause some interesting questions for countries like the UK, also for Europe, about dependencies. Where are our dependencies on other countries, on supply chains? Do we now need to worry not just about dependencies on China, but you see some people, particularly in Europe, wondering about dependencies on US technology and having, how much US technology you have in your stack, and what does that mean if, the US wants to go after Greenland or do something like that? These are becoming quite interesting and complicated questions to do with risk, supply chain, dependency, and technology, which I think, you could argue the UK is in a vulnerable position, or you could argue if the UK is nimble and builds coalitions and positions itself carefully and builds on some of its safety and security reputation, could do something interesting and could, strengthen its position. So I think it is a kind of interesting and perhaps slightly precarious position to be in.
Case for optimism for the UK and AI. Well, the first thing I say, I think you're absolutely right. And I think something that is maybe a bit underrated is just after the last US presidential election, JD Vance flew to Europe, and everyone, maybe not everyone, but if you follow this stuff closely, everyone remembers he came and gave this speech at the Munich Security Conference, and he lectured Europe on all the things that were getting wrong. That was his second stop on the tour. His first stop was in Paris, where he went to President Macron's AI Action Summit and gave sort of a version of the same talk, but on AI. The first line of the talk was, "The future of AI is American models running on American chips." And the sort of invitation was, if you really behave really, really well, we might let you have some of it. But the idea that there would be any sort of independent capability was not on the table. So is there a case for the UK being a power in AI? I think there are three cases you can probably make. And I would say that if I'm honest today, the potential massively outweighs the reality. So, case one is we do have a really great AI ecosystem in the UK, and particularly in London. There are three big labs really that are meaningful today. There's OpenAI and Anthropic, and then there's Google DeepMind. Google DeepMind came out. DeepMind, which is a London-based startup founded in London by Brits. They sold to Google, sadly, a very long time ago. But I would say probably the most consequential decision made in British AI in the last decade was Demis Hassabis's decision not to move to California when that transaction took place. And as a result, we have 3,000 researchers in King's Cross who've spawned an ecosystem that I think is really world-class. And so I think it's still plausible that things will come out of that will be important and meaningful. That's case for optimism one. Case for optimism two is that the UK really does have extraordinary state capacity in the understanding of the security implications of AI that I think is certainly unparalleled outside the US and China, but arguably in the world. In fact, Mythos, one of the interesting things is that Mythos was made available to two governments, to the US and to the UK, The US obviously in the weird position of simultaneously being a supply chain risk, as Gordon said at the start, and also didn't have the capability to run a full suite of evaluations on it. The one government organization in the world that did and published it was the UK AI Security Institute. And actually, I think it's a very different capability from actually having the frontier labs, but I think it's an important one that might become more important as capabilities improve. The third one I would say is that there is something, particularly in this geopolitical moment, about middle powers and like the opportunity for new coalitions. And I think the UK clearly, among middle powers, has a leading position and ability to convene, but also some real assets. The first job I did in government was being the lead negotiator for the AI Safety Summit that Rishi Sunak put on, and it was actually quite remarkable what they achieved, what Sunak achieved in being the convener. So I think as this tension between the US and the rest of the West continues to increase, and I suspect it will, I think there is an opportunity for leadership there.